Throughout history, there have been few rivalries that compare to that of Britain and France. Separated by a short 21-mile stretch of water, the two countries have clashed aggressively over the last 1,000 years at world-famous battles such as Hastings, Agincourt and the Battle of the Boyne. The last time they clashed, in 1815, in a field near the Belgian village of Waterloo, the British swept to victory, setting in an era of relative peace, material prosperity and technological progress in Europe, and consigning Emperor Napoleon to exile. The British and French wars, fought between 1793 and 1815, of which Waterloo was the climax, had many major effects of the future in Europe and the fates the countries would fare over the coming centuries. This is the focus of today's episode, where we will discuss what happened in these wars, who fought them, and why they were fought. It is first important to establish the key players in the events that are about to unfold. Firstly, the French are led by the infamous Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, a master of military strategy who enjoyed a meteoric rise through French society to sit as the sole leader of a newly republican French state. His military genius made him revered by his troops, and he engineered some of the greatest tactical victories ever seen in war, against the Austrians and Russians at Austerlitz, and against the Russian, Austrian, Sweden and Russian forces at Leipzig. The British are commanded on the battlefield by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. A rigid and strict commander, Wellington had a keen eye for slackness but earned the trust of his soldiery through his incisive and rarely incorrect decision-making. He believed in keeping local people on side by supplying goods from home, but was at a disadvantage when it came to the strength of his army. Before the French wars, the British army was in an extremely poor state. Having been defeated in the American Wars of Independence, it was low on morale and much smaller, at 40,000 troops, than the French army of conscripts. The British government was not keen to fight a war in Central Europe against Napoleon, so instead preferred to fight a peripheral campaign against the French, the most notable of which was fought on the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal. Napoleon's intentions of an invasion of Britain were quashed by a crushing victory by Horatio Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, so his eyes turned greedily westwards. In Spain, a bitter fight for the crown between Manuel de Godoy, the Prime Minister, and Ferdinand VII was overseen by King Charles VI. This unstable period was fertile ground for Napoleon, who subsequently invaded, arrested all three men, and instated his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as king. The Dos de Mayos uprisings then began in Madrid and sparked widespread chaos across the country. Although the central Spanish government had collapsed, the Cortes of Cadiz, acting as the Spanish government in exile, began effective guerrilla resistance across the country. To solidify his position, Napoleon insisted the Portuguese join the continental system, an effective economic strategy created by Napoleon to prevent the British use of ports, intending to cripple them into submission. When they refused, Napoleon ordered Marshal Junot to invade the country, with John I escaping to Brazil. Britain had been allied with Portugal since 1389 under the Treaty of Windsor, so were obliged to assist. The ability to open a second front against Napoleon was also irresistible, so it was in this backdrop that the 30,000 British soldiers arrived in Portugal to challenge the clearly dangerous but fatigued French. Wellington made quick gains, defeating Marshal Junot at Vimeiro on August the 21st, but soon found himself superseded by two new arrivals on the peninsula, Sir Hugh Dalrymple and Sir Harry Berard. The Convention of Sintra, allowing French troops to escape on British ships, angered Wellington greatly, but he returned to sole command in April 1809. Lieutenant General John Moore, who had been in command of the British forces pushing into Spain, was unfortunate to meet a French force with Napoleon at its head and had been killed at the Battle of Corunna. So Wellington faced an uphill battle through the arid fields of Portugal and Spain if he was to do Napoleon, who was back in Paris at this time, any real damage. He began what would turn out to be a long and arduous campaign in September 1809. Equipped with extensive knowledge of the Iberian geography and the support of the local populations, Wellington began his work, often placing his troops on the reverse slope of a hill out of sight of the enemy, forcing French troops to run uphill into British volley fire. At the Battle of Telveira, Wellington was unable to exploit a narrow British victory, so retreated into a series of earthwork fortifications that had been constructed around the city of Lisbon, called the Torres Vedras. The British then implemented a scorched-earth policy of everything outside the Torres Vedras circle. This caused the French, who lived on the land during the campaign, to suffer through a hungry and cold winter, whilst the British rested behind the lines. Captain Jean Noël of the French army commented on the cruelty of the scorched-earth policy.
and burning as the English laid waste to the countryside, seizing and burning as the population fled them. Being forced to get resources by any means it could, the army resorted to pillage.
By 1811, Wellington was out of the Torres Vedras and moving into Spain. His defensive genius had been well documented at this stage, but it was now his chance to demonstrate his tactical nous when on the offensive. He moved to besiege the town of Almeida, where French commander Massena soon arrived to try and stop him. At Fuentes de Onoro, a fierce battle was fought between the two commanders. It lasted for 3 days, with bayonet fighting in the streets and a number of near-catastrophic tactical failures, such as a British infantry being caught in the open and having to retreat in squared formations against advancing cavalry. The battle culminated in the French slipping most of their troops out the city and leaving Wellington victorious but longing for a bigger and better victory. Although Wellington was annoyed, Massena had to return to Paris to face the wrath of Napoleon, and it was apparent that the war was beginning to turn in the favour of the Spanish and British forces. It was at this point Napoleon made a critical military blunder. He decided to invade Russia with 500,000 men, which resulted in veteran troops being withdrawn from Spain to aid the eastern effort. Equipped with this knowledge, Wellington decided to adopt a more aggressive approach. He moved to strike the town of Ciudad Rodrigo and the border fortress of Badajoz, involving weeks of siege work, but eventually resulting in a bloody British victory. The townspeople suffered greatly in these cities, enduring the city sieges and then rape and pillage from the British troops. The loss of 5,000 British troops was also a major blow, so much so that the staunch and emotionless Wellington wept from the city's defences after it was taken. Wellington continued his march through Spain, although was intensely paranoid during this period, sleeping with his horse saddled and going for days without proper sleep. Wellington faced the French again at Salamanca, where he shielded his army and through a series of complex flanking manoeuvres caught them by surprise, scattering them and causing heavy casualties amounting to nearly 10,000 on the French side. At this point, Wellington reached the Spanish capital of Madrid and was declared a national hero. This did not satisfy him, and he pushed onwards to Vitoria, the town where the French had fallen back to in the north. Wellington enacted a tactically masterful and crushing offensive from all sides, cutting off retreat and squeezing the enemy. This hammer blow caused the French to again retreat towards their border, pursued by a formidable British force who had gained much confidence after winning battle after battle after battle. This was the end of the Peninsular War, as Wellington pursued Marshal Soult in bitter conditions over the Pyrenees and back into France. Britain's army had its reputation restored, and Napoleon had been dealt an important defeat. His aforementioned invasion of Russia, to which he had committed so much, was an abject failure, and by 1814, Britain, Prussia, Russia and Austria had descended on Paris. Napoleon was to be exiled to Elba with a personal guard of 1,000 men, although this didn't prove to be the end of his involvement in this series of military engagements. Louis XVIII was installed onto the French throne, and the Allies withdrew from France. However, it would transpire that this would only be for the next 10 months. In February 1815, King Louis XVIII, settling into his new life as the new monarch of Spain, received news that he could scarcely believe. Napoleon, so recently exiled to Elba and deemed out of the picture, had returned to the French coast at the head of a 600-strong force. He immediately sent Field Marshal Ney to deal with this force swiftly and arrest the former emperor, but when the force switched allegiance and joined Napoleon, he fled the country to England. Napoleon had retaken Britain without firing a single shot and returned to the French throne to widespread support from the public, who had been suppressed and impoverished under Louis. Britain, Prussia, Russia and Austria wasted no time in declaring war, and Wellington once again prepared to fight the French. Wellington led a Western coalition of forces in Brussels, consisting of Belgians, Dutch and Germans, as well as planned cooperation with Prussian forces under Field Marshal Blücher. Wellington moved his forces but was attacked by Field Marshal Ney at Quatre Bras. He held position at the crossroads, but Blücher, fighting at Ligny, lost to a French force led personally by Napoleon and pulled back towards Brussels. Blücher guaranteed that he would be at the next battle, so Wellington moved to a field near the village of Waterloo for a face-off against Napoleon. The British occupied 3 fortified positions: the chateau at Hougoumont, the farmhouse at La Haisson, and the village at Papelet. The battlefield was only 4 miles long, but was filled with 68,000 Allied troops with 156 guns in support, against 72,000 French troops supported by 246 guns. Wellington understood that his chances of winning without Blücher were slim, so intended to hold out until he arrived. Rain and illness hankered Napoleon on the morning of the battle, meaning the offensive did not begin until 11 o'clock, where the French moved to attack Hougoumont. An infantry attack was repelled, but a heavy battery on the chateau caused some Belgian and French troops to break and flee. At this stage, the battle was in the balance. Napoleon's illness had been steadily worsening throughout the day, and at this point he left the battlefield, leaving Ney in command of the army. Wellington moved his troops out of range of French artillery, and Ney mistook this for a retreat, ordering a cavalry charge at the apparently fleeing British. At the sight of the advancing cavalry, Wellington formed his infantry into squares, highly effective against cavalry, and inflicted heavy casualties against the French. Napoleon returned to find his army in chaos, and then learned that the Prussians had shaken 30,000 French troops sent to pin them down and would shortly be joining the battle. In a final move of desperation, Napoleon committed his elite guards, including the Old Guard, a group of infantrymen who had never been defeated in open battle. The French columns marched uphill into heavy British infantry fire and began to waver. A bayonet charge ordered by Wellington then broke the Old Guard, just as the Prussians joined the fray. The French army then disintegrated, fleeing and surrendering to Allied forces. Prussian cavalry pursued the retreating French, and Napoleon slipped away back to Paris. This defeat marked the end of both the British and French wars and Napoleon's leadership, as he was subsequently exiled to St. Helena, never to return to the country that he had gained so much glory and land. Wellington, once again victorious, returned to Britain as a revered hero and began a successful political career, later becoming Prime Minister. Under his command, he had changed the image of the British soldier from scum to a respectable profession, and his iron constitution and military strategy had won the day for the Allies. Britain and France would then become allies, fighting on the same side in the Crimean War and World War I, although suspicion would remain between the two countries for many decades after, as was the major impact of the climax of this rivalry.